So we've seen very simple examples of HTTP requests and HTTP responses, the fundamental way we exchange information on the World Wide Web. And so the question for Node.js as a web server is, how do we then build HTTP requests and responses? How do we parse them? That is, break them up and into their pieces and then use that information. Well, essentially, again, we're just talking about formatting. We're talking about putting together an HTTP response. You could almost think of it like a text file, basically, in a proper format with the headers and the body and the proper name-value pairs and the proper statuses that can come back. Well, there's actually a program embedded inside of Node.js that does that. We can take a quick look, and also the JavaScript code that wraps it. Let's talk about HTTP parser. The HTTP parser code that is found inside the Node.js core can be found at github.com/joint/http-parser. And so this is a C program and is embedded in Node, but is really a separate program that could be used elsewhere. And what it does is it parses requests and responses. It takes that information, which ultimately is text, in some format, and other binary data, and then parses it. That is to say, breaks it up, looks at it, and knows what to do with it. So it breaks apart the kind of things that come along for the ride, like headers, those name-value pairs, and the version, the body of the message, the status codes. So it can look at an HTTP request, and it can look at an HTTP response, and it can break it apart for us, and then we can then have those different pieces of data as separate pieces of data, and then make decisions with them. And again, it's just a bunch of C code. And if you know C, you can go right in here and take a look and see what it's really doing. But we can also see that there's more going on because the HTTP parser is wrapped inside of the Node.js JavaScript side of the core, and also other features added to it in JavaScript itself. If I open up the JavaScript side of the Node.js source code, I can find in the lib folder an http.js file, and that's what I would require in order to get access to these abilities of creating HTTP requests and responses. There's also an HTTPS file for dealing with secure or encrypted connections. But we'll see inside this http.js file that it's actually using a number of things. It's going to use the event emitter, no surprise there. And it also is going to use a number of different modules that start with _HTTP within Node, JavaScript modules, common, outgoing, HTTP server, agent, and client. So Node.js is coded not just to be able to respond and send HTTP responses, but it can also go out and request information from the internet elsewhere on the internet itself and make an HTTP request. But if we were to take a look, for example, at _HTTP_server.js, we'll see, and I'll just scroll to the top here, that it grabs the HTTP parser. It wraps it. It gets that code, that feature from the C, C++ side of the core. But it adds on other concepts, like we have a list of the status codes, the different statuses that could come back from an HTTP response. And it wraps the idea of a response coming back from the server with a number of features and different methods that can be called on it. We have the ability to write a header, that is, add our own name-value pair, a header that will be part of what is created when that HTTP response is put together. And it's really a string that's being put together. We have a status line, that first line that we saw, and the code that defines if everything's okay or not, or what has happened as far as this response is concerned, if there's an error or otherwise. And again, that's wrapped up in here. So it's building that HTTP response format. It's building a big string that's formatted properly, in other words, and a whole lot more. So we can create a server that will listen for data being sent to our web server, and being passed to the port that we say that Node.js should listen on. And if I switch back here, after scrolling around a bit, to HTTP, I can actually find a method called createServer. And it says, give me a listener. So in other words, a function that will be invoked whenever information is sent to me. So when an HTTP request shows up, then run this function. And that function will then handle what it should do with that request. And it will also give that function the ability to respond to the request. And that's what a server does. It accepts requests and it gives a response. But how you want to actually deal with that request and response will be handled by your own function that you can give to the HTTP server object, and it will then give you what you need to actually be able to send and receive the HTTP requests and responses, and then do things as a result of them. All right, so when we're then wanting to create our own server in Node, we have all the pieces that we need. We have the ability to connect to the internet, to send a request or to receive a request, and to send a response. So now we're ready to use this HTTP module and the other things that we've learned to build a web server in Node.